Barry, so what's the one question you have about it personally? For example, its authenticity. You know it was used to cover the historical body of Jesus. But what's the one doubt or what's the one question that you have about it?
Yeah, what is the mechanism that created the image? Remember, that was what brought me on board.
Hmm.
And I personally still believe, and much to the chagrin of many of my friends, that we don't have enough answers yet to exclude some form of natural explanation for the image. Now, I think I already said this, but I'll say it again, that if it was a naturally occurring event, it was still a unique, one of a kind event. So if you wanted to call it miraculous, not necessarily in a supernatural way, but just miraculous statistically, I wouldn't debate that. I would agree because to my knowledge, it's the only image we have ever found with those properties on it. And modern science, and there have been countless attempts to duplicate the shroud, but nobody's even come close to matching the physical characteristics documented on the cloth. You can make something that looks like the shroud. People have done that until you get up a little closer and you start comparing it to the actual shroud, and you find that nobody's even close.
Hi guys, I'm here again with Barrie Schwortz. Now, Barry was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, that's STURP, the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the shroud in 1978. Today he plays an influential role in shroud research and education as the editor and founder of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, which I'm on now, shroud.com. It's the oldest, largest, and most extensive shroud resource on the internet, with more than 15 million visitors from over 160 countries. In 2009, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association Inc., STERA Inc., a non-profit corporation to which he donated the website and his extensive shroud photographic collection, as well as many other important shroud resources, in order to preserve and maintain these materials and make them available for future research and study. He currently serves as the president of Stura Inc. So Barry, welcome back to the show. It's great to be able to talk to you again. How have you been? What have you been doing?
Well, I've been great, except for some computer problems. You might notice the background's a little different because I'm using a different computer pointing in a different direction than I've done in the past. The main computer's having some issues, but we're working on it. In the meantime, this computer, which is the one I used to travel with to show my presentations, uh, is holding me for a little while, but it isn't a big enough hard drive for me to put everything in it that I need. So I still have the old laptop over here and the new one I'm speaking to you on. And it's been frustrating. I had to postpone or cancel our 28th anniversary website update on January 21st because I couldn't access the HTML files.
Oh, okay.
That software's in that computer over there, and the last time I launched that software, it crashed the computer.
But it's
So
there, it's present.
yeah, so look, in the end, I need to get new software. I need to get a new computer. They only last so long, and so I'm making do with it. In the meantime, at least I can continue the basic functions that we need to do without too much difficulty.
So when is the next update coming on the newsletter? When is the next?
Only God knows the answer to that. I
Right,
don't
okay.
know.
Right,
In the
okay.
spring, I'm assuming.
Great, fantastic. Looking forward to that.
That
Barry,
narrows it down to the next 3 or 4 months.
well, good luck with that. I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
that. Barry, so then in our last interview, we covered a few of the topics, a few of the themes to do with the Shroud of Turin. So we know that the shroud is authentic. How do we know that it was actually used to wrap Jesus? We know that
Well,
we know it's been established that it is actually authentic. Uh,
well, in not in the minds of everybody.
well, at least science hasn't disproved that, though. Science
Well,
hasn't.
that's a good point. That although science can't prove that that's Jesus with that was in that shroud, there's nothing in the scientific data that takes away from the possibility that it was.
And
Makes
yeah,
makes sense.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. But what would you say is the strongest evidence to say that it was Jesus, not
You
just
know,
some
I
other
get that
man?
question frequently, Michael, and the answer really is all of the above. There's so much evidence that it's overwhelming. Just recently, Joe Marino, who's on our board of directors, called me up and said he was going to write an article listing the various disciplines and subdisciplines that have been involved in the study of the shroud. And when he told me that, I estimated maybe 30 different disciplines. When he finished his article, and it's published on Academia now, he came up with 102 different disciplines or subdisciplines that have been directly involved in the study of the shroud. Now, when you have that many disciplines of such a broad variety, it's pretty hard to pick just one or two things and say, well, this is it. It's all of the above. It's just an overwhelming amount of data. And a lot of people complain that shroud.com is too big and too deep and has too much information. Not my fault. That's what's available on the Shroud. We put it out there for everyone. And like it says on the opening paragraph of shroud.com, we believe that given the facts, you have to make up your own mind about this. We're not going to tell people what to believe. Here's the evidence. You decide, you
Hmm.
know?
For me, anyways, it was the crown of thorns. That was the giveaway
Well,
that.
in looking at the wounds and scourge wounds and other wounds on the body that are documented on the shroud, one of the things that makes me believe it was Jesus of Nazareth is the fact that although the Romans crucified lots of people and they scourged lots of people and they may have even speared people in the side, I don't know. Uh, what they didn't do to everybody is crown them with a crown or cap of thorns. That was specifically done for Jesus because he had proclaimed himself the King of the Jews. So to humiliate him and to torture him even further, then they put this nasty thorn bush on his head. And to me, that's sort of the significant bloodstain on the shroud that says, they didn't do this to everybody. As far as we know, they only did it to one man, and that was the historic Jesus of Nazareth. Now, people have criticized me for not becoming a Christian, and I've had to explain to people that one can look at the peer-reviewed science. And of course, I've had a firsthand front row seat to that. You can look at the peer-reviewed science, and you can look at the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, and you can see that there is a connection there. Whether or not he was the prophesied Messiah from the Old Testament is a separate issue. And so I can accept that we have a man named Jesus of Nazareth and that this is the cloth that wrapped him after he was tortured to death. Whether or not he was the Messiah, is a separate issue that I leave more to the theologians than me trying to postulate something that I'm not qualified.
Mhm.
I can have my opinions, but they're unqualified along those lines. So I try and stay within my lane and not extrapolate beyond what I can support with the data I'm familiar with. And that's called good science. You don't draw conclusions beyond what the data supports.
Hmm. So
Simple as that.
do you feel any connection to, let's say, to the man Jesus to the historical Jesus, like in a metaphysical or a spiritual sense, or do you just put that
Well,
aside, as you said?
I I do, but not in the way that most Christians would. Um, I look at what was done to this man. I look at the fact that he willfully submitted to this torture and stood up for what he believed in, and it cost him dearly. The way I see it, how can one as a human being not be empathetic and feel that here's a man who died believing strongly enough in his own beliefs that he was willing to be tortured to death to support those beliefs? How can you not feel something positive about that man and empathetic? Whether or not he was the Messiah, is a good question. Coming up here next week, I'm speaking to a Messianic Jewish organization who are Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And the rabbi of that congregation was Orthodox, but converted to Christianity and became a Messianic rabbi. So there are many Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and many Jews that have not. And the way I see it, each person has to really reach that conclusion personally for themselves. Even Jesus said that the kingdom of God is within us, or words to that effect. And that means it's really a personal choice. We can look at that piece of cloth, but it doesn't tell you what to believe. That piece of cloth may stimulate you to look inside yourself and see what you believe. Many people don't even know what they believe. But the answer to faith isn't going to be on a piece of cloth, but in the eyes and hearts of those who look at it. And that fits right in with what Jesus said, that the answer is within us. And so each of us has to reach that spot by ourselves.
I'm curious, Barry. What is the kingdom of God for you? I'm just curious. What, how would you explain that?
Everything. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. Belief in God was never an issue. That was just taken for granted, of course. And we followed all the rules and did the candles, and my grandfather who lived with us, grandparents lived with us. My grandfather would get up every morning and do the morning prayers, and put the tefillin on and wear his shawl. And so God was part of everything every day. Um, we didn't have a specific time for it, although obviously Friday evening, the beginning of the Sabbath, is a kind of a milestone each week. And of course, there were the Jewish high holidays that come, around each year. But we followed the rules pretty closely. And I found some of them to be a bit archaic and some of them to be very relevant even to this day. So, to me, my faith is in a higher power, in God. I live out here in the mountains. When I look out and I see God's creation without a bunch of buildings and, you know, human stuff, that is the best reminder of God's creation, is because I lived in Los Angeles and the view out the window was the building next door. That's not exactly exciting. But here I look out on God's creation virtually untouched. And to me, that's what God did. What I saw in Los Angeles, that's what men did.
Mhm.
There's a difference. So I can make that distinction subtle. But look, my involvement with the Shroud forced me to reconfront my beliefs because people kept asking me that question. What do you believe? What do you believe? They weren't talking about the Shroud anymore. They were talking about faith. And I always said, well, look, I've always had faith in God, but at the same time, it was something separate from everything else for me. And I did not devote myself to God. I devoted myself to living a good life, which is what I believe God would want of me.
Mhm. Fantastic answer, Barry. When the Shroud, when I look at the Shroud, there is a message in it for me, at least, that's this man, Jesus, he transcended death. What do you think happens when we die? What happens?
I really don't have a clue.
Hmm.
I'm hopeful that people are correct in that there is something afterwards. But
Hmm.
my thought has always been, I know for sure that I've got this lifespan to deal with, and that what I do in this lifespan is up to me. So I try and do as much as I can now when I know I can actually do something, in hopes that afterwards I'll be able to continue doing something good and positive as well. But just in case I can't, I'm hedging my bets and doing the best I can now.
A good way of looking at things.
Well,
Barry,
it's up to us, it's up to us. It's not up
sure.
to God. God gave us free will, free Free will is important. And in the end, if there is a judgment, as both Christians and Jews believe, what will we be judged on if not the choices we made during our lives?
Hmm.
So I try and make good choices.
Barry, we know. Okay, what do you think? There's any credence in the argument that Jesus mightn't have died, that he might have been revived instead of resurrected? Do you think that?
Look, I have in the UK and England, I have been for 5 years in a row with the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. That's their belief that Jesus survived the tortures and crucifixion. And there's a tomb of Jesus in Kashmir, the disputed area between Pakistan and India. I'm not sure who's in the tomb, but my Ahmadiyya brothers and sisters believe that's where Jesus is buried. Um, I don't know if they're right or wrong, but to me, that doesn't really change my beliefs in any way, whether or not he died of the crucifixion or whether he survived and died in India, as some believe, um, isn't relevant to my faith. My faith is in God.
Mhm.
And that's not Jesus. That's not necessarily Jesus, but God incarnate. So, you know, that's not what my Christian brothers and sisters like to hear, but that's my honest opinion.
Hmm. Hmm. Why do you think the church hasn't let it being tested again, the shroud? Why do you think
Church has
it's
had nothing to do with it being tested.
so it's not their choice? Oh, sorry, yeah, it was the Savoy family that
There you go.
yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
So,
if it had been up to the church in 1978, we would have never been given permission to examine the shroud. No, I think that it was King Umberto, who was a wise man, and as Mel Brooks used to say, it's good to be the king. Uh, he was a wise man. He evaluated our test plan, which was like 70 pages long, and realized that we were not only exercising the extreme respect for it, the shroud, but also extreme care in making sure we caused it no harm. And I think he realized that it was time to allow science to have a good look at it, but I don't think the church was thrilled about it. The custodians in Turin, people used to say, well, wasn't it nice Turin gave you permission? Turin didn't give us permission. If anything, they were angry that a bunch of American scientists were given permission that they'd never been given, and they're right there in Turin as custodians of the cloth itself. So I can understand some resentment, and to this day, some of them still are resentful of the fact that Stirp was given its permission and they had never been given such permission. I could look, I can understand their resentment. If I were in their shoes, I probably would have felt the same resentment. So I'm not holding that against them, but it's 45 years, 46 years later. Where's that forgiveness that Jesus talked about? Don't get mad at us. We were given an opportunity and we took it. Don't be angry with us. Be angry with the king who's passed away and he doesn't care anymore.
mhm. Barry, what do you think is the most persuasive evidence for its authenticity? What is the
Uh,
most persuasive?
That's easy. There's an image on that cloth that modern science cannot duplicate or explain, at least not at this moment in time. And beyond that, I mean, look, we've proven it's not a painting, a scorch, a photographically made image. It's not a man-made image. I've had people say, "Oh, it's a graven image," and I have to remind them, I'm Jewish. We had a golden calf, cost us 40 years in the desert. Okay, so we know what a graven image is, and it's a man-made object. And we've proven the shroud image is not a man-made image. Now, does that make it supernatural? Or does that mean that there was some yet undiscovered natural mechanism that created the image? And we don't have enough data to exclude that as a possibility. So we don't have enough science. It's only had one in-depth examination in its entire history, and that was 46 years ago. And the technology has advanced so dramatically in those 46 years that another go round of testing similar to what we did, but using 21st century technology, might answer some of the questions that remain unanswered, or some of the new questions that our data, when we collected and brought it back, brought up new questions. So it really becomes an issue of allowing science another opportunity, and I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future.
Why not?
Well, I'll be candid. I think now that it is in the hands of the church in a sense, the Pope, not the 130 cardinals, but the Pope himself, it certainly serves the church's purpose best to remain a mystery.
Mhm.
Think about it. What if
To
what if we were to prove it was a fake or prove it was authentic? Would that change anything? Probably not. It might make a few people come on board, it might make a few people leave.
Mhm.
I'm not convinced that would make a big difference in the world. There are
Mhm.
skeptics of the shroud. No matter what evidence you present them, they still deny it. And there are people who would believe it under any circumstances. I've often said that if God himself came down and pointed to the shroud and said, I did that, there would still be skeptics.
Talking about the skeptics, what's the silliest argument you've heard against it? What's
Um,
the what?
every skeptical argument is pretty silly because there's scientific data that wipes them away.
What's the one that gets on your nerves the most about it being a medieval painting? No.
Well, yeah, I always laugh when I read or hear or watch a podcast where somebody says, "Oh, it's just a painting." You can't have a painting if there's no paint. There's no paint or pigment or binders or anything on that cloth that would indicate. And think about this. This is a piece of woven cloth. If anything had been applied to create that image, it would still be there embedded into the fibers of that cloth. We'd have found it. There's zero, none.
But didn't the artists they used to leave their canvases down on it and
Ah,
traces
so
of paint got
they found some particulates of pigment on the shroud, pretty much scattered evenly across the entire cloth in very minute quantities to a point where if you were to scrape it all together into one pile, you'd still need a microscope to see it. That's how little amount there is. And if this were an actual painting, I mean, there would be massive quantities still on that cloth. It's not a painting.
the,
Simple as
the
that.
the image it fades out as well. There's no outline on the image. It fades
Yeah,
out.
if typically an artist will start with an outline. And if you look at the photographically made image by Nicholas Allen of South Africa, he's an art historian, he actually went through the trouble of making a camera obscura, coating a sheet of linen with a silver salt solution, and used the camera obscura to expose a statue onto the cloth. And it has a very sharply defined edge because he focused the pinhole that he used as a lens accurately focused because you move the cloth to a point where it's in sharp focus from the light coming in through the hole. And he got a very sharp outline, and you compare that to the shroud, which fades out at the edges, and that's because there's a correlation between image density on the shroud and the distance between the cloth and the body when the image formed. That's not something that's typical. That's unique in all the world that I've ever seen. And what it tells me is that there was some interaction between a cloth and a body, whether it was a chemical reaction or something beyond that, has yet to be finalized and determined. But I firmly believe that we don't have enough data to exclude a natural explanation for that image. Um, I mean, look, may sound like a stupid question, but why would God go outside of the universe and realm that he created to put a simple image onto a piece of cloth? He doesn't need to do magic tricks to do that. He's God. so, so the way I see it, there's a possibility that this image formed by some natural mechanism. Now, look, a lot of people want to call it a miracle. I don't dispute that because even if it was a naturally occurring event that created that image, it's such a rare event that if you wanted to call it miraculous, I wouldn't argue with you. But it isn't necessarily supernatural. Not necessarily. It might be. It might be. I don't exclude that as a possibility, but we don't have enough data yet to exclude the scientific explanation.
I had Dr. Andrew Silverman on this show, and he was coming from the position that um, the shroud image is a message to us all that we have the same innate power within us, whether it's natural
Well,
or supernatural. But
and
it's like a signpost for us all.
yeah, and look, I wouldn't argue that point. I mean, it's there. It has served as a signpost through the centuries for many people, either to rediscover their faith or to come to their faith because of it. So certainly, I wouldn't argue with Andrew, who's, by the way, I know him quite well, um, and I understand his point of view. That's a much more philosophic point of view than I have. Remember, I come from the natural sciences, and I have to point out to people that science must stay within the observable and the measurable. Faith has no boundaries. And so people can look at it. I've said this to people face to face that if your faith tells you that this is meaningful to you personally, far be it from me to want to dispute that.
Mhm,
I'm not going to debate that with people. That's something that if it moves them in a positive way, then it served a great purpose.
mhm.
So, but it's up to each individual, and different people respond to the shroud differently. So there isn't just one reaction to the shroud. There's an infinite number of reactions to it. So I can't point to one and say, well, that's the definitive answer. The answer is if it's got some significant meaning to a person individually, then that's the message it conveys to that person.
When you were there studying the shroud with your other team members, what reactions did you observe in those?
There really wasn't much of a reaction. We didn't have time to we had to set aside our emotions, we had to set aside our personal beliefs. We had 5 days and nights, literally around the clock, to accomplish a vast array of experiments and we had to deal with being in a 400-year-old building with parquet wooden floors that when you walked on them, it moved. Traffic being routed next to the palace so that every time a truck or a bus went by, the building would vibrate. And we weren't in a laboratory. We were in a 400-year-old building with frescoes on the ceiling. So, dust particles would fall. And it was truly a challenge. And we had to adapt to every bit of every day. There was a new challenge, sometimes a dozen different new challenges every day. And we had to just work our way through those. And we did.
Barry, you're one of the few men who have one of the few people who have left their DNA on the shroud. If you were left in a room by yourself with the shroud now, what would you do? Let's say you were left in a room for an hour with the shroud, completely alone. How do you think you'd react then? How would you perceive yourself?
No, that's a good question. It's not one anybody's ever asked me before. So there you go. I can't say that too often, that's a new question. I'm really not sure. I would probably be studying the image because that's what brought me on board in the first place. I said no when they first asked me to participate because I didn't want to get involved in a religious thing that I felt unqualified to be a part of. But they assured me that no, no, this was strictly science about the image. And there's a slight irony in the story in that the gentleman who invited me on to the STIRP team was one of the other Jewish guys. So, so it's kind of ironic that I got invited onto it. But then think about this: the man of the shroud is another one of the Jewish guys. So when people have said, "What are you doing involved with the shroud?" I go, "Well, it's a Jewish burial shroud of a Jewish man. Why shouldn't another Jewish man be involved in its study?"
Mm. So there's another argument, and it was quite a good one until it was pointed out. I think I heard it in one of your interviews where when the body is lying down, the body of Jesus, it's impossible for a body to be lying down and for it to cover the private parts with the hands.
Yeah.
However, if the head is resting on something, it's possible then. Can you go into that a bit?
Yeah, no, and frankly, depending on your physical characteristics, you can lay on your back and put and cover your groin if you want to. You try it sometime, you'll see you can actually do it, but it makes it simpler. And if you look at, and I've been to the catacombs in Rome, if you look at the tombs typically of that era, they all have a stone block where the head gets slightly raised, maybe what is that, 5, 6, 8, 10 centimeters, something like that. Not a lot, but enough. And that makes it even easier for the hands to cover the groin. So that's just a skeptical attempt at debunking the shroud based on lack of knowledge.
Hmm. Hmm. What other kind of gotcha questions comes to your mind? What other kind of gotcha questions that are easily answered?
I'm Michael. I'm used to answering them, not asking them.
Hmm. Mm. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just wondering what other kind of questions do you get
Oh,
for example, that
well, one of the stranger questions that I remember standing in front of an audience and saying, "Okay, I'm opening it up for questions now, and no questions are off limit." I said, "I've probably heard them all anyway." And as soon as I said that, a young woman put up her hand and she said, "Well, what did the shroud smell like?" Nobody had ever asked me that before. And that was God smacking me upside the head and saying, "Don't be so arrogant. You don't know as much as you think you do." And so, and the question is, there was no particular smell. We were already in a 400-year-old building with 400-year-old parquet wooden floors, and the whole building was musty smelling. So there was no distinctive odor coming from the shroud. It just smelled like everything else in that room, old.
Barry, so what's the one question you have about it personally? For example, its authenticity. You know it was used to cover the historical body of Jesus. But what's the one doubt or what's the one question that you have about it?
Yeah, what is the mechanism that created the image? Remember, that was what brought me on board.
Hmm.
And I personally still believe, and much to the chagrin of many of my friends, that we don't have enough answers yet to exclude some form of natural explanation for the image. Now, I think I already said this, but I'll say it again, that if it was a naturally occurring event, it was still a unique, one of a kind event. So if you wanted to call it miraculous, not necessarily in a supernatural way, but just miraculous statistically, I wouldn't debate that. I would agree because to my knowledge, it's the only image we have ever found with those properties on it. And modern science, and there have been countless attempts to duplicate the shroud, but nobody's even come close to matching the physical characteristics documented on the cloth. You can make something that looks like the shroud. People have done that until you get up a little closer and you start comparing it to the actual shroud, and you find that nobody's even close.
So people have actually tried to replicate it. They've
Oh, countless times.
and they've tried to put forward the argument that as an explanation for this.
Yeah, they've done it with painting, they've done it with heat, but we've proven none of those are valid for what's on that shroud. One of the theories back even in the days before Stirp was that there was a metal sculpture of Jesus, and they heated it up and they laid the shroud onto it and scorched the image onto the cloth. Well, that was a viable proposed theory, and you can't discard it just because you don't like it. So we did ultraviolet fluorescence photography of the shroud, And, there are documented scorches that run down both sides of the shroud from a fire in 1532. We know the exact date and time of the fire. So those are, we have the provenance for those scorches, and we know that it occurred, where it occurred, and how it occurred. And so when we photographed the actual documented scorches with UV fluorescence photography, the scorched areas, which were a product of a higher temperature event, fluoresced red. The background of the cloth has its own fluorescence, sort of a yellow-green, kind of very subtle, but yellow-green fluorescence. And the image does not fluoresce at all and quenches the background fluorescence. So there's no fluorescence in the image. And if it had been created by a high temperature event, it would have fluoresced in the red and we'd have been finished. But it didn't. So we eliminated that as one of the possibilities.
What other in your last update in your newsletter? What's happening in it? What are the latest happenings in it?
Not a heck of a lot.
What has been the
look, there are people that are trying to continue to do research, but the real issue is access. Much of the best research that could be applied to the shroud today would require access to the shroud again. And since they're not permitting that, people are using methods that have never been used for things like age dating and trying to get a date from that. But unfortunately, you can't come up with something new and say, oh, look, this proves the shroud's this old, when that technique has never been used for age dating any organic samples ever in its history. So maybe some of these techniques will become viable age dating techniques at some point in the future. That's possible. But until that occurs, these are just claims that are being made that can't be supported by any credible data.
Can you
And that's very frustrating.
Can you test the age of blood? Is that possible?
I don't think they can. And especially because blood being an organic substance and it degrades over time. So I don't think they can. Plus, nowadays, the blood, everything on that cloth is so contaminated. DNA, for example, I always get people asking me, why don't they do a DNA analysis of the shroud? And I said, well, that's because every human being that's come in contact with it for the last 2,000 years, whether they leaned over it, touched it, breathed over it, cried over it, kissed it, they all left their DNA on it. And then to make matters even worse, in 2002, they did a clandestine intervention they called a restoration, where they removed the original patches sewn in by the Poor Clare sisters in 1534. They removed the backing sheet that the sisters had sewn on in 1534. They scraped away stuff on the cloth. They steamed it to get some of the wrinkles out. And the two women who performed the intervention didn't wear gloves, hairnet, mask, and they handled it for 32 days straight and left their DNA and handled every square inch of that cloth.
This
and
was
they
in
left their
2002?
DNA. I'm sorry?
This was in 2002?
Yes. And they left their DNA on every square inch of that cloth, or every square centimeter. I'm sorry, speaking to Europe. At any rate, if we were to do a DNA analysis today of the man of the shroud, we'd find he's a Swiss woman.
You'd think they would have known better in 2002. Like if you told me this, like this happened in like 1840, 1846 or something.
That's why the 2002 intervention was so controversial. There's a page on shroud.com called Comments on the Restoration. And when that restoration was done, I was inundated with emails from many important shroud scholars voicing their opinions on what had been done. And you can read that, it's still on shroud.com. And so it was not well received by the scientific community, of course, or even the historians, because what they did was they manipulated it. When they were finished, the shroud was between 7 to 10 centimeters longer than when they started. So we don't know how much distortion might have been introduced to the image. It's a herringbone weave. You pull that cloth in any direction, it stretches in all directions. When we put it on our table and held it in place with magnets, we were very careful when we smoothed it out not to stretch the cloth, but to just smooth out the wrinkles without stretching it, because we knew that if we did any stretching, we were going to distort the image.
And when you guys got it, they were using thumbtacks, right? Yeah, did they
Well,
edit?
yeah, they were worried about us. We designed a steel table, shipped it across the ocean to fasten the shroud to it with magnets that were coated with Teflon. And when we got there, the shroud had been on public display for 5 or 6 weeks at that time. And when they finally removed it from public display and brought it to us to examine it, they had to remove it from the board. And when they pulled it out and we saw it had been thumbtacked to a piece of wood. There, and every place there'd been a thumbtack, there was a little hole with a little circle of rust around it. It's the way, thumbtacks are made of very cheap pot metal. And so they oxidize very quickly and leave a little circle of rust.
What was your
And
reaction to that then? Were you
shock. And I've often said that they were worried about us. Look at the trouble we went through to make sure we didn't cause any harm. And they crucified it. They've thumbtacked it to a piece of wood. Well, look, ignorance, and I don't mean that in a gross way, but ignorance from a scientific point of view. Look, the people in Turin view this more from a theological or spiritual or religious aspect than from a scientific one. I understand that. And so I don't hold that against them. I mean, that's what we had to deal with.
do you
And
still
so
teach? Do you still teach in the Pontifical College?
I do. As a matter of fact, I just had an email from them earlier today. I have to update my last 12 lectures.
So
I'm
when
not
you
sure exactly when I'll get to that. It's on
Mhm.
the agenda.
What do you do in that case? I'm just curious, Barry. Is it like you're just
Well,
going?
these are PowerPoints, and each lecture is approximately 45 minutes. And there's the first 12 lectures detailed the STIRP information up till 1981. The second half of the course, the next 12 lectures, are the science done since 1981. And so that part needs some updating. There's a few new things that have come out that should be there, but not much because they haven't given anybody access to the shroud. And without access, a lot of the new data and the new instrumentation that we might want to use can't use it on a photograph. You have to have the actual shroud in front of you. And until they allow that again, and I don't see that happening in my lifetime.
Who has access to it apart from the Pope, of course, the owner of it? Who
Oh,
did?
oh, what he does.
So no cardinals, no bishops, no priests,
No,
nobody's allowed in.
that restoration that was done in 2002, at the time, the Archbishop of Turin was a cardinal. But after the restoration, I don't think the Pope was very happy. And I think at that point would have been either Benedict, it probably was Benedict. He was not happy with what they did. So when it came time to replace the Archbishop of Turin, instead of a cardinal, they put in a Monsignor. The Monsignor absolutely is the Archbishop of Turin, but he can't do anything on his own. He has to go through Rome for everything. Where a cardinal might have some authority to do certain things. So I think Benedict put a person in there that he knew would have to come through him before they did any more things to the shroud that might put it at risk.
Who was the Pope at the time when you were doing it? Which Pope was in charge?
There was no pope at the time.
No? How is that
Isn't that
possible?
isn't that hard to believe? I often say that in my lectures and I get wide-eyed responses. The night before we flew to Turin, Pope John Paul I died.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We got to Turin. We didn't know if we were going to get permission or not because the Pope had just died. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 days after we finished our examination that John Paul II was elected. So during our examination of the shroud, there was no Pope.
I'm sure there's some significance in that that we can't explain. That just seems so weird, so
Well,
uncanny.
it's you should see the faces of people when I say, "Oh, by the way, there was no Pope when we examined the shroud." And they, well, that's not possible. I go, yeah, that's possible. Well, look, if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, there was a time when 130 cardinals couldn't come together to elect a new pope, and I think there was a 6 or 7 year period where there was no pope in the Catholic Church. So a couple of weeks is no big deal compared to its history.
So there was a lot of commotion going on that time when you were
It was
there.
pretty crazy. Oh, and at that point in time, in 1978, there was something called Brigata Rosa, the Red Brigades. Remember, the mayor of Turin then, I don't know about now, was from the Communist Party. And he granted us his blessings. He was very cooperative, but the Red Brigades were marching in the streets, chanting and marching with signs and poles and things. And I
So
remember leaning out my hotel window and looking down at these guys marching. And I was going to take some photographs, and I thought the better of it. I said, if somebody sees me doing that, they might fire a couple of bullets in my direction. I better not. And so I ducked my head back inside the hotel room.
how is the cardinal a member of the Communist Party? That doesn't make
Not the
sense.
cardinal. No, no, the mayor. The
Oh, the mayor.
mayor.
Excuse me. Okay, okay. Now I'm with you. Now I'm with you. The equipment you had back then, Barry. What would be the equivalent of it nowadays? Like how much? Like even money in a financial in a money sense, how much? What was it worth? The amount of equipment that you brought
Well,
over?
it's hard to say because much of the equipment was loaned to us by the manufacturers. But today, the difference would be smaller, more compact,
Hmm.
more sensitive imaging sensors and all the other kinds of sensors that we use in our imaging work have been far more refined than what we had available to us in 1978. Nobody's shooting photographs on film anymore. It's all digital. And so basically, all we really would want to do would be to use the equivalent modern instruments to repeat the experiments that we did before. As an example, for example, Dr. Alan Adler, our blood chemist, one of the other Jewish men on the team, he had technology that was the most advanced technology available in 1978. But since then, the technology, and so he was able to determine things like blood type or whatever else. Today's technology would make the results scientifically more confirmed than what we could say about the data that we took in 78 because of the precision of the instruments that has increased dramatically. So even though nobody thinks that Adler was wrong, we could confirm his observations and conclusions to a scientific certainty. Where right now, scientists can look at it and go, yeah, but that's old technology, and the newer technology could give us a better answer. We know that. That's why we would love to have gone back a second time, but
Hmm.
that never happened.
Does this frustrate you, or have you just accepted it? Like you
Well,
just accepted that that's just the way it is, or
it's always been frustrating, but at the same time, you have to accept what it is. There's no way that I'm going to change or you're going to change what's going on in Turin or in Rome. And this Pope, I've been told by people in Rome, is not going to do anything with the shroud. I think about it. The radiocarbon dating was a fiasco. The restoration was a fiasco. So the last two times they did something with the shroud, it did not turn out well. And this Pope, I think, is smart enough to say, I'm not going to mess with it. I don't, he doesn't want to put his hands out there and
When
get his fingers chopped.
when is the next showing of it? When are they going to be showing it to the public?
We
There's
don't
no.
know because
Mhm.
there was an intended public exhibition that John Paul II had suggested in 2025 because it's the next holy year of the Catholic Church. How many Jews know that, do you think? At any rate, recently, Irina Tomidi, who is the textile expert that works with the Turin Centro, the center, pointed out that the method of displaying the shroud over the last 100 years or so, where it's in a glass case and then they turn the case horizontally. I mean, the shroud is displayed horizontally, but they turn it up, that the weight of the cloth is pulling down and causing damage to the cloth within that case. So when she brought that up, they decided not to have a public exhibition in 2025 only because they need to find a different way of displaying it that minimizes any potential harm to the shroud, which makes good sense. But it's also going to take them a couple of years to figure out how to do that and bring in thousands and thousands of people without it being up on display the way it has been over the years. Now, what they finally decide, we talked about mirrors. I was on the phone with the secretary of the Turin Centro, I guess it was 8 months or so ago. And he was the one who told me that they were going to have to postpone another public showing. And he explained why. And look, the care and making sure that that shroud is preserved so it's there for future generations is more important than anything right now than a public exhibition. And I understand their rationale for that. But knowing Turin and understanding the impact it has on that city when there is a public exhibition, they're not going to let too much time go by before they try and find a solution and fabricate and make a working solution so they can show the shroud again. Because in part, the economy of Turin is benefited by the shroud being publicly displayed. So much so that King Umberto, in his will, when he left it to the living Pope, made one stipulation: it must remain in Turin forever. And that's because Turin was the seat of power of the Savoy family. It almost became the capital of Italy at one point. Instead, they decided on Rome, of course. But, and so, to me, it makes sense to do everything they can to preserve it so that a future generation of researchers perhaps will get permission, and maybe someday there'll be a better answer than the ones we can give today. But right now, I find that the most honest answer to many of the questions that people ask me is, we don't know.
Mhm. What's the environment, Barry, that it's kept in now? Where is it? Like it's kept in,
It's
I'm
kept
presuming,
in a special cabinet in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, where it's been for centuries. It's kept flat. It's no longer rolled up on a dowel and stuck in a wooden box, which isn't very good from fire safety point of view. The cabinet is fireproof. The shroud is kept flat. It's in a nitrogen argon atmosphere. Its temperature and humidity are controlled by computers. It's light tight, fireproof, as I said, very important. And they can move that cabinet, roll it out with all the equipment attached to it behind it, and display it. And that's what they've done for the last couple of public exhibitions. It was the fire in 1997 that destroyed the Guarini Chapel and damaged the cathedral and the palace that prompted them to find a better solution than a wooden box.
mm,
And so at least they've done that, and we give them great credit for what they did. I think the Italian gas company put up 25 million euros to design and fabricate a better cabinet to store the shroud in. So today it's better preserved than ever in its entire history, and that's a good thing.
What book would you recommend somebody read to get a good comprehensive
Well,
understanding?
what facet of the shroud are we interested in? There are books on forensic pathology. There's a book by Joe Marino on the radiocarbon dating, the definitive work on radiocarbon dating of what happened before, during, and afterwards. That's over 800 pages. And every bulleted point that Marino makes in that book, he's got a reference of where that information comes from. No slouch is Joe Marino. He researches it thoroughly. But then he worked at the Ohio State University Library for 35 years. So if anybody knows how to find stuff, it's Joe Marino. And so he's done a great job. But what I like about his work is he cites the sources of his information so that it isn't just his opinion that he's giving. But that's only about the radiocarbon dating. Is there a single book? Well, some of the Ian Wilson books, the 1998 Blood in the Shroud book is pretty good, but it was done in 1998. That's what, 25, 26 years ago now. It's no longer as up to date as it could be because things have happened since, like the radiocarbon dating sort of being finally overturned.
I heard you mention once that you were thinking about writing your own book, saying that it wasn't my idea or something
Yeah,
like
this was
that.
not my idea.
What's going to come of that? Was that just a joke,
Well,
or are
God,
you
God
really
willing,
serious?
he'll give me ample time to get that accomplished in my life. But I don't know. I mean, it's taking every minute of my waking hours to do this work. This is all I do.
What keeps you so dedicated, Barry? Why are you so dedicated to this one topic? I'm sure you've got other interests, of course, in
Well,
life,
I do.
but
I do. What keeps me dedicated is the realization that being in that room in 1978 was not just a privilege, it brought with it an obligation. I was there to document the event, not for myself. I was there, I could see it. I didn't need to do anything more than see it. I was there not in that room for me. I was in that room for you. And so my role in all of this, I see the website as the fulfillment of the obligation that came with the privilege of being in that room. And I'm not finished yet. So I'll keep doing this until God says you're done.
well, Barry, I personally appreciate you and your work, and I've been following you for a long time, and I've always found you very, very insightful, and you've definitely helped me in many ways.
Well,
Barry, where
I'm glad to know that. I don't like to make this about myself. People call me an expert, and I always say, well, you be the editor of Shroud.com for 28 years and work with every major Shroud scholar in the world. See how much you learn. I mean, of course, I've been privileged to work with so many of these researchers and learn from them. I learned empiricism from the guys on the STIRP team from Los Alamos National Lab and Sandia National Lab and the Air Force Weapons Laboratory. And thank God these were empirical scientists, or they could have blown up the world by now.
can you give me an instance of that when they were working in an empiricist as in an empirical way? Can you give me?
Every facet of every moment of every day of every week, it was always empiricism. Ray Rogers, the chemist on our team from Los Alamos, he encouraged the website. He liked the website. I was very thrilled when he told me that. But every once in a while, I'd write something and publish it, and I'd get a phone call from Rogers, and he goes, "We don't have enough data to say that's proven. Change it."
Wow.
Okay, Ray. And I would go and I would change it. So I would say it was a constant thing, the empiricism. And like I say, I'm grateful that those men who were responsible for atomic bombs and other types of weapons, be thankful that they were as empirical and careful as they were, or they could have blown the planet up by now. So I take great pride in having learned empiricism from that group of men.
Barry, thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you and your stuff? Where can they?
Very simple. Shroud.com.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you for having me back.
Thank you. Thank you.